The Deep South has always been a place of quiet battles, but tonight it's become a war zone. The Blooded Sons have just made their biggest mistake, marching into a black town with fire and fury, expecting to find an easy target, a town of black families too isolated to fight back, too afraid to resist. They came with 30 armed men, with torches and rifles, with a certainty that this place would fall like so many before it. Instead, they've walked into a battlefield designed by warfighters. Marcus Kane, a man the world once called Ghost, an operator who left bodies in the sand before returning home to something worth protecting. Darius Hayes, a sniper whose eye has never missed when it mattered most. Leon Carter, a demolitions expert who turns arrogance into tombs. Samuel Evans, a medic who's seen too much blood to let this town bleed. For the people of Haven's Rest, this wasn't just another act of hate. It was a war for survival in an increasingly hostile America. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe and comment if you have ever experienced racism. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over Haven's Rest, bathing the quiet streets in hues of deep amber and gold. The air was thick with the scent of magnolia and the distant aroma of smoked barbecue drifting from a backyard pit somewhere down the road. It was the kind of peace that Marcus Kane had fought for overseas but never truly found. Until now. He walked alongside Darius Hayes, Leon Carter, and Samuel Evans, his closest friends, men he had bled with, killed with, and nearly died with on foreign soil. They had come home to Haven's Rest, not because they were running from war, but because they had hoped to leave it behind. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Leon said, hands in his pockets as he took in the sight of kids playing in the street, old men gathered on porches swapping stories over glasses of iced tea, women laughing as they exchanged bags of groceries. "It's peaceful," Darius muttered. Marcus nodded, though he knew better than to believe in peace. The world didn't work that way. That's when they heard it. Engines. Loud, roaring engines. They turned just in time to see a convoy of lifted trucks tearing through the town square, dust kicking up behind them like a storm rolling in. Big tires, tinted windows, American and Confederate flags waving from the beds, shotguns propped up against dashboards. Something about the way they moved, fast, reckless, too confident, made Marcus's gut tighten. Leon had already shifted, angling his body slightly, instinctively prepared for a fight. Darius followed their trajectory with sharp, calculating eyes, and then the trucks were gone, speeding down the road toward the outskirts of town, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their engines and the growing tension that now settled in the air. That's when they saw him, lying in the dirt, barely moving, a man too old to be treated this way, too respected to be left like this. Reverend Elijah Brooks. Samuel was the first to move, dropping to his knees beside him. The old man's face was swollen, one eye shut, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. His breathing was labored, and even as Samuel tried to check his vitals, Elijah gripped his wrist, holding on with what little strength he had left. Marcus crouched beside them, his voice low, steady. "Who did this?" Elijah exhaled shakily, his fingers curling against Samuel's arm, as though holding on to his last breath. His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "They said this town ain't ours no more." Silence. A long, slow-burning silence, the kind that stretched just before a trigger was pulled. Marcus stood, rolling his shoulders, jaw tightening, eyes cold as death. Leon wiped a hand down his face, exhaling sharply, muttering, "Well, I guess war ain't done with us after all." Darius nodded toward the direction the trucks had gone, his voice as sharp as broken glass. "So let's find out who just signed their death warrant." Samuel pressed a damp cloth against Elijah Brooks's temple, his hands steady despite the quiet storm brewing inside him. The old man winced but said nothing, his breathing slow, deliberate, as though he knew any sudden movement might unravel the fragile hold he had over his pain. The four men had brought him to the small medical clinic near the town center, a modest building with faded white walls and a single overhead fan that turned sluggishly, stirring the thick, humid air. The town doctor, an older woman named Miriam Wallace, worked quickly, examining the bruises, checking for broken ribs, doing what she could with what little she had. Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face unreadable as his gaze swept over the room, taking in every detail. The way Elijah's knuckles were scraped raw, the way his clothes were torn, the deep, ugly swelling along his jawline that told him the old man had been struck more than once. Not in some random act of violence, but with intent. Darius stood near the window, his sharp eyes scanning the street outside, watching for movement, for signs that the men who had done this were lurking, waiting to finish what they started. He had seen this before, not here, not in Haven's Rest, but in places overseas, in villages where men with power and weapons had tried to erase the people they deemed unworthy of existing. It always started small. A broken window, a missing person, a message carved into someone's flesh, and it always escalated when no one pushed back. Leon, standing near the doorway, exhaled through his nose, a deep, measured breath, the kind that barely contained the frustration burning beneath his skin. His hands curled into loose fists at his sides, his voice low, steady, controlled. "You gonna tell us what happened, Elijah? Or we gotta start making some guesses." The old man didn't answer right away. His fingers twitched against the edge of the examination table, as though he was considering how much to say, or maybe whether it even mattered. But then his shoulders rose with a slow, tired breath. And when he spoke, his voice was rough, worn down like the bark of an old tree that had weathered too many storms. "They said Haven's Rest was a mistake," Elijah murmured, his swollen eye barely able to open, but his remaining gaze fixed on Marcus, as if he knew out of all of them, he would be the one to understand what that meant. "They?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. Elijah's fingers curled slightly. His voice quieter now, but no less certain. "They call themselves the Blooded Sons." The name settled into the room like an unwelcome guest. Marcus didn't move, didn't react, but something in the air shifted. A stillness that felt like the moment before a sniper pulled the trigger. Samuel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I should have known." Leon's jaw tightened. "Sounds like one of those little internet groups that talk big when they got numbers and anonymity, but ain't worth a damn when they're standing face-to-face with a real fight." Elijah chuckled, but the sound was weak, almost hollow. "They ain't just talking, son. They're doing." Marcus finally pushed off the wall, stepping closer, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of something far heavier than words. "What did they say?" Elijah swallowed, his throat working around the pain. "They told me we weren't supposed to be here, that we built something in a place where we didn't belong, that our town, our families, our history was a stain they were going to wipe clean." The words hung in the air, thick and unmoving. They weren't just threats, they were promises. Darius finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual, but sharper, like the edge of a knife. "They ever come like this before?" Elijah nodded, just barely. "They started small, like all cowards do. A few broken windows, some spray paint on the church doors, slashed tires. Then a house burned down last month, old Miss Avery's place. She's been living here since before I was born, and they didn't care. Nobody got hurt. But that wasn't the point. They were testing us, seeing how much we'd take before we pushed back." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. He had seen this before, in other places, in other wars. Terror wasn't about the first strike. It was about conditioning, making people feel helpless, convincing them that resistance was useless, that one day they would wake up and realize they had lost everything before they even knew they were in a fight. "Sheriff know about this?" Leon asked, his tone edged with disbelief, though the answer was already obvious. Elijah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, he knows, but he ain't lifted a damn finger. He came by after Miss Avery's place went up, told us he'd look into it. That was it. The next week, Someone put a noose on my front porch. You think he came by then? Leon's fingers twitched, and Darius let out a slow, controlled breath, grounding himself before the frustration took hold. Samuel was silent, his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. How many of them are there? Marcus finally asked. Elijah exhaled, shaking his head. Enough. Marcus turned to Darius, whose eyes were already on him, a silent understanding passing between them. We need to find out exactly how many, Marcus said, his voice calm, measured. We need to know what they have, who's backing them, and what their next move is. Because they're not done, not yet. Elijah shifted, looking at him, something dark, and knowing in his one good eye. You sure you want to get involved in this, son? This ain't your war. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. It is now. The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't uncertain or heavy with hesitation. It was absolute. Darius stepped away from the window, rolling his shoulders. I'll start with the local bars. See if anyone's been running their mouth about who they answer to. Leon nodded. I'll check the truck stops. These kinds of cowards always got people on the outside funding them, supplying them. If they're getting help, we need to know where it's coming from. Samuel grabbed his medical bag, checking its contents like a soldier inspecting his rifle. I'll go see Miss Avery. If they burned her house, she might have seen something before they did it. Marcus didn't move, his mind already running through the next steps, the next choices, the next kills that would have to be made. Because this wasn't about just finding out who was responsible. It was about making sure it never happened again. We meet back at my place in 2 hours, he said finally. This ends before it starts. Elijah let out a slow breath, watching them. Something unreadable in his expression. He had seen men fight before. He had watched people rise up and get crushed. Watched history repeat itself time and time again. But this time, something was different. This time, the ghosts were already moving. Marcus moved through the streets of Haven's Rest like a shadow, his boots quiet against the pavement, his presence unnoticed by the handful of people still out this late. Most of the town had settled in for the night, doors locked, lights dimmed, a quiet unease hanging in the air, like the calm before a storm. The people of Haven's Rest had spent generations building something that should have been untouchable, a place where black families had carved out prosperity, safety, and dignity in a world that had tried to deny them all three. But the Blooded Sons had made their intentions clear. They weren't here to take over. They were here to erase. Marcus had spent his life studying men like them. He had seen their kind on different soil, different flags draped over their shoulders, different causes on their lips. But the sickness was always the same. Men who needed an enemy to define themselves, who could only see their own strength when someone else was on their knees. It wasn't enough for them to thrive. Others had to suffer. Sheriff Tate had been a dead end. Marcus had stopped by the station first, more out of principle than any real expectation of cooperation. Tate had been sitting behind his desk, feet up, flipping through a hunting magazine, his expression unreadable when Marcus mentioned the name The Blooded Sons. He had shrugged, muttered something about no evidence and boys being boys, and then dismissed him with an empty promise to keep an eye on things. Marcus hadn't pressed. Tate wasn't the kind of man you reasoned with. He was the kind of man who waited until the smoke cleared so he could pretend he'd been neutral all along, which meant Marcus needed another source. He turned down a back alley, moving past the old general store, its windows dark, past a rusted-out pickup that hadn't moved in years, until he came to a bar that barely deserved the title, The Last Stop. It was a place built for men like Tate, men who liked their company the same color as their liquor, pale and cheap. Marcus had never stepped foot inside, never had a reason to, but he knew its reputation. It was where the men who talked about the good old days whispered about ways to bring them back. He pushed open the door, stepping inside, his entrance barely noticed by the handful of regulars hunched over their drinks. Cigarette smoke lingered thick in the air, masking the scent of stale beer and sweat. A couple of old songs hummed low from a jukebox in the corner, but the place was mostly silent, men drinking with their heads down, lost in whatever thoughts made the world outside feel smaller, simpler. Marcus moved to the bar, nodding at the bartender, a wiry man with deep lines on his face and a permanent frown carved into his features. His name was Buck Rawlins, a man with no real loyalty beyond the price of a drink, and someone who had a habit of knowing things he shouldn't. "Kane," Buck said, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. "Didn't think this was your kind of place." Marcus ignored the bait. "Looking for some information. Do you know anything about the Blooded Sons?" Buck exhaled through his nose, wiping a glass with a rag that looked like it had seen better days. "Name rings a bell." He didn't look up. "But ringing bells don't mean much unless you're listening real close." Marcus leaned against the bar, voice low. "I'm listening." Buck finally looked up, considering him for a long moment. Then he sighed, tossing the rag onto the counter. "I heard talk." "That what you want?" Marcus didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. Buck scratched his jaw, then spoke, casual, like he was commenting on the weather. "They don't like what Haven's Rest is. Say it don't fit." He poured himself a drink, took a slow sip. "Say it's an insult. A town like this, standing as long as it has, makes them feel small." He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "And you know men like them, Kane. Ain't nothing in this world they hate more than feelin' small." Marcus didn't respond. He already knew that truth better than most. Buck glanced around, then lowered his voice slightly. "Word is, their boss got more boys comin' in. They ain't just burnin' stores no more. This ain't about sending a message. It's about cleaning house." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "When?" Buck hesitated. "Dunno, but soon." Marcus pushed away from the bar. "Where is he?" Buck exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I ain't got a death wish, Kane." Marcus let the silence stretch between them, long enough that Buck shifted uncomfortably. Then, finally, he gave the slightest nod toward the back exit. Marcus didn't thank him. He turned and left, stepping out into the night air, the humidity wrapping around him like a second skin. The alley behind the bar was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp down the road. He moved carefully, staying close to the wall, footsteps light. And then he heard it, a grunt, a muffled voice, the unmistakable sound of flesh meeting flesh. He rounded the corner and saw a man pressed against the brick wall of a closed shop, an older black woman pinned beneath his grip, her face twisted in fear. Marcus moved without thinking, his hand wrapped around the man's wrist, twisting it hard, a sickening crack cutting through the air as the man yelped, stumbling back. The woman staggered away, gasping, and Marcus stepped between them, his eyes locked onto his target. The man was younger, maybe mid-30s, lean but wiry, with a shaved head and a tattoo peeking from beneath the collar of his jacket. He cradled his broken wrist against his chest, spitting at Marcus's feet. "Ain't your business." Marcus didn't speak, just waited. The man sneered, eyes flicking to the woman. "She shouldn't be here, no way. None of you should." Marcus didn't blink. "And why's that?" The man's lips curled, his face ugly with hate. "This ain't your people's country. Ain't never been. It was a mistake letting them get this far. But don't worry." He grinned, despite the pain in his wrist. "We're gonna fix it real soon." Marcus stepped closer, slow, deliberate, until the man had to tilt his head to look him in the eyes. "Is that right?" The man didn't flinch. "Yeah. And you?" His grin widened, teeth stained yellow. "You don't belong here either." Marcus exhaled, slow, controlled. Then he grabbed the man's shattered wrist and twisted, hard. The scream was instant. The man dropped to his knees, gasping for air, his free hand slapping against the ground. Marcus crouched beside him, voice cold. "You come from my people in my town and see what happens." The man whimpered, nodding rapidly. Marcus released him, standing back to his full height. The man scrambled away, clutching his arm, disappearing into the night. Marcus turned to the woman, his voice softer now. "You all right?" She nodded shakily. "Thank you." Marcus watched the woman disappear down the street, her hurried footsteps fading into the night, the fear still clinging to her despite her relief at escaping. She had been shaken, but not broken. Another reminder that Haven's Rest was filled with people who had survived too much to be easily shattered. But survival wasn't enough. Not this time. He turned, his mind already shifting gears, replaying every word the man had spat at him. Something was coming. That much was clear, and it wouldn't be like the quiet terror they'd used before. No more broken windows in the dead of night. No more veiled threats left on doorsteps. This was going to be open, violent, final. Marcus clenched his jaw as he moved, slipping through the back alleys, taking the longer route home, always aware of his surroundings. Old habits, the kind that never really left you. The same instincts that had kept him alive in war zones across the world now guided his every step through the streets of his own home. By the time he reached his house, the others were already inside, waiting. The place was nothing special, just a modest, two-story home sitting at the edge of town, like everything else in Haven's Rest, built with care, meant to last. But tonight, it wasn't just a house. It was a war room. Darius was near the window, rifle across his lap, gaze locked on the street outside. He had always been the watcher, the one who saw the threat before anyone else did, the one who could sense a fight before it started. Leon sat near the kitchen, hands on his knees, his posture loose. But Marcus knew him well enough to recognize the tension beneath the surface. Samuel stood near the dining table, arms crossed. Quiet, as always. But his silence wasn't hesitation. It was focus. Marcus closed the door behind him and exhaled, shaking his head. It's worse than we thought. Darius finally looked away from the window. How bad? Marcus moved toward the table, pulling out a chair but not sitting, hands braced against the wood as he let the words settle before speaking. They're not just burning businesses anymore, he said, his voice even, but carrying the weight of what he had seen. They're hunting now, and they're getting ready for something big. Leon exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. That woman you saved, she say anything? Marcus shook his head. Didn't need to. The man who had her, he told me all I needed to know. Samuel narrowed his eyes slightly. He talk? Not the way we'd want him to, Marcus admitted. But he didn't have to. Something's coming. Soon. And when it does, it won't be a handful of men breaking windows. It'll be all of them, coming to take everything. Darius leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers tapping lightly against his rifle. Then we don't wait for them to make the first move. Marcus nodded. Exactly. They had fought wars before, seen battlefields across the world, but this was different. This was home, and that meant one thing. They had no intention of losing. Leon cracked his knuckles. All right, so, what's the plan? Marcus glanced around the room, at the men who had fought beside him in places most Americans would never hear about, at the men who had bled for each other, who had survived the worst the world had to offer. And now, they were about to fight again. But this time, they weren't fighting for a government that saw them as expendable. They were fighting for their town, their people, their history. Marcus exhaled, his voice steady. We make sure they never get the chance to take Haven's Rest. We hit first. We set the battlefield. And when they come, his eyes hardened. We make damn sure they never leave. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was absolute acceptance. Samuel finally nodded. Then let's get to work. Haven's Rest was a quiet town, but that didn't mean it wasn't strong. People had always underestimated it. The Blooded Sons had made that mistake when they thought the town would roll over and accept its fate. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. That night, the Seals split up, moving through the town like ghosts in the dark. Darius scouted vantage points, marking the best rooftops for sniper nests, the alleys that could serve as ambush sites, the roads that could be turned into kill zones. Leon worked with a few trusted locals, setting up explosives. Not enough to level buildings, but enough to send a clear message. Samuel gathered supplies, working with the town's few hunters and ex-military men, teaching them how to handle themselves when the bullets started flying. Marcus met with Mayor Sarah Carter, laying it all out. "This is going to get ugly," he told her. "You need to make sure the people who can't fight are ready to get out if they have to." She had nodded, jaw tight. "We're not running," she had said, "but I'll do what needs to be done." By dawn, Haven's Rest wasn't just a town anymore. It was a fortress, and when the Blooded Sons came for it, they wouldn't find prey. They'd find warriors. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that sat thick in the air just before a storm. Haven's Rest had always been quiet at this hour. Porch lights flickering, dogs barking in the distance, the occasional hum of a truck rolling down the old roads. But tonight, the silence wasn't peace. It was something else entirely. It was anticipation. Marcus knelt on the rooftop of a 2-story building at the edge of town, his rifle balanced against the ledge, eyes locked on the main road leading into Haven's Rest. Below him, the town was asleep, or at least it would appear that way to anyone who didn't know better. The houses were dark, the streets empty, but behind those locked doors and shuttered windows, there were people waiting, armed, ready. The Blooded Sons thought they were coming for easy prey. They had no idea they were walking into a battlefield. His earpiece crackled with Darius's low voice. Movement. 6, maybe 7 trucks. 2 vans behind them, heavily armed. Marcus exhaled slowly. They were coming in like they were running a military operation, the way men who had never actually been to war played at being soldiers. He had seen it before. Men who thought rifles and numbers made them strong. Men who had never once faced something they truly feared. They were about to learn. Leon's voice followed over the comms, calm and steady. Boomers in position. Traps are live. Samuel's voice came next. Medical teams prepped. Let's try not to need 'em. Marcus tapped his radio once in acknowledgement, then went still, waiting. The convoy rumbled into town, headlights flooding the street in stark white beams, engines roaring like they owned the place. He could hear the shouts of men hyping themselves up, laughing, talking like this was all some game, a hunting trip where the prey had nowhere to run. Marcus shifted slightly, adjusting his rifle, focusing the scope. He wasn't aiming for the grunts. Not yet. He was looking for leadership, for the man who had pulled this together, for the one whose fall would make the others stumble. And then he saw him, standing in the back of a lifted black truck, dressed in fatigues that didn't belong to him, his hands resting on the edge of the cab like some self-proclaimed general surveying his conquest. The leader. Even without hearing his voice, Marcus recognized the type. Arrogant, self-assured, a man who didn't fight his own battles, who surrounded himself with men willing to kill and die for an ideology they barely understood. A man who thought he was untouchable. He wasn't. The trucks slowed as they neared the center of town, and the men inside started spreading out, stepping onto the streets like they were stretching their legs, like they were already picturing what would burn first. And then the first explosion hit. A deafening boom erupted from beneath the lead truck, flipping it onto its side in a shower of fire and metal. The force of the blast sent men sprawling, some screaming, some silent in the wake of the sudden destruction. Panic set in immediately. The ones who had been standing in the truck beds jumped down, rifles raised, eyes darting wildly in the darkness. Marcus pulled the trigger. The shot was clean, silent, and deadly, and the man nearest the fallen truck dropped before he even realized he had been hit. Darius followed an instant later, his rifle singing from the rooftop across the street, another body falling in the chaos. The gang had been loud before. Now they were silent. For the first time, they understood that they were being hunted. Shouts rang out, men calling to each other, struggling to organize, trying to find an enemy they couldn't see. One of them fired wildly into the dark, the muzzle flash giving away his position, and Leon sent a second blast tearing through the street. Another truck ignited, flames licking high into the night, smoke curling into the air like a signal of death. More shots, more screams. The Blooded Sons had numbers, but they were fighting ghosts. And then, amid the chaos, Marcus saw him running, the leader, the man who had stood tall when they first arrived, confident and untouchable, was now ducking low, moving fast, trying to slip away unnoticed while his men fought and died in the street. Marcus moved. He descended from the rooftop with practiced ease, his boots hitting the ground in silence, his body blending into the shadows as he cut through the alleyways, closing the distance. The gang leader, whoever he was, whatever name he had given himself to justify his place in this war, was fast, but he wasn't fast enough. Marcus caught up just as he reached the outskirts, grabbing him by the back of his jacket and yanking him hard. The man barely had time to gasp before Marcus slammed him into the brick wall of a closed storefront, his forearm pressing hard against his throat. For the first time that night, Marcus got a clear look at him. He was young, younger than he expected, maybe early 30s, white, sharp-jawed, with the lean build of someone who had spent more time barking orders than taking hits. His eyes were bright with panic, his mouth twisting into something between a sneer and a plea. Marcus didn't speak. He just pressed harder, forcing a choked gasp from the man's lips. "You want to tell me who you are?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, almost casual. "Or do I have to start pulling answers out of you the hard way?" The man struggled, hands grasping at Marcus's arm, but he wasn't strong enough to break free. "You don't know what you're doing," he rasped, his breath hitching. "You think this ends tonight? You think this town's gonna survive? There's more coming. More men, more fire. You think you—" Marcus cut him off by slamming his head back against the brick. Not hard enough to kill, but enough to make his vision blur. "That's real nice," Marcus murmured, "but you're not in charge anymore." He pulled a zip tie from his belt and secured the man's wrists behind his back, yanking him forward, forcing him to move. The battle was over. The gang was retreating. Whatever illusion of strength they had arrived with had been shattered. Their men were dead, their trucks were burning, their leader was in chains. The blooded sons had come to Haven's Rest, thinking they would erase it. Instead, they had been the ones wiped out. Marcus led the captured man through the empty streets, stepping over bodies, past the remnants of a fight that had never been fair, a battle that had been decided before it even started. Darius's voice crackled over the radio. "They're running!" Leon followed a second later. "What about their leader?" Marcus tightened his grip on the man's collar, dragging him forward. "We got him." The gang had come expecting to conquer. Now they were nothing but the first warning. They wouldn't be the last, but it didn't matter. Haven's Rest was ready. The sky had barely begun to lighten when Marcus shoved the bound man into an empty storeroom near the town center, a converted supply space behind the old barber shop, its walls lined with wooden crates and rusted shelves stacked with tools and discarded hardware. The gang leader stumbled, landing hard on his knees, his breath hitching as he twisted to glare at them, his eyes sharp despite the bruising already forming along the side of his face. Leon shut the door behind them, locking it with a deliberate click, and the air in the room seemed to shrink, the space closing in on the man who had, just hours ago, arrived in Haven's Rest with every intention of burning it to the ground. Now, with his hands zip-tied behind his back, the blood of his men still drying in the streets outside, he looked less like a leader and more like a man who had just realized he'd made the last mistake of his life. Marcus crouched in front of him, forearms resting on his knees, his expression unreadable. "Name." The man shifted, jaw clenching, the muscles in his neck tightening against the restraint. "Go to hell." Marcus exhaled slowly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the knife he always carried, flipping it open with an ease that didn't feel like a threat, because it wasn't. It was a promise. He set the blade against the man's thigh, not pressing down, just letting the weight of it settle there, the sharp edge resting against fabric that was one twist away from cutting into flesh. "You already got one foot in it," Marcus murmured. "You sure you want to keep running your mouth?" The man swallowed, eyes flicking between Marcus and the others. Darius stood near the back wall, arms crossed, silent, his gaze heavy, unreadable. Samuel leaned against a crate, hands resting loosely at his sides, but there was something coiled in the way he stood, like a blade waiting to be drawn. Leon, closest to the door, let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Let's get one thing straight," Leon said, voice low, almost conversational. "You're not walking out of here unless we let you. You understand that, right?" The man's lips twisted into something that might have been a sneer, but there was fear behind it, a crack in the arrogance he had carried when he arrived. "You think this ends with me?" he spat. "You think you stopped something? You don't even know what you just started." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "So why don't you tell me?" The man exhaled sharply, licking his split lip, shifting his weight like he was considering his options. Then he laughed, a rough, bitter sound. "More are coming. You think you made a stand tonight? You think you proved something? All you did was light the fire." His breath hitched slightly, but he recovered quickly, leveling his gaze at Marcus. "They're already on their way." Darius pushed off the wall, his voice quiet but edged with something lethal. "How many?" The man smirked. "Enough." Marcus didn't react. He let the silence stretch between them, let the weight of the moment settle over the man like a noose tightening around his neck. Then he stood, flipping the knife closed with a flick of his wrist, tucking it back into his pocket. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" he asked, voice calm, even. The man didn't answer, but Marcus could see the way his shoulders tensed, the way his body braced like he was waiting for the hit to come. "I know what war actually looks like," Marcus continued. "You play at it, dress yourself up in stolen valor, tell yourself you're fighting for something real, but you don't even know what that means." He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "Your people are dead. The ones who made it out are running scared. And the men you're waiting for?" His gaze darkened. "By the time they get here, they won't be finding a town to take. They'll be walking into a graveyard." The man's smirk faltered, just slightly. Leon sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "What do we do with him?" Marcus stared at the man for a long moment, then turned away, stepping toward the door. "Lock him up, somewhere he can think about his choices." He paused just before exiting. "We've got bigger things to handle." Outside, the town was waking up. The fires from the night's battle had been smothered, the wreckage of the gang's failed assault still scattered across the streets, bullet casings and blood staining the pavement. People had gathered, their faces tight with exhaustion, with fear, but also with something else, something harder. Marcus stepped out, feeling the weight of 100 eyes turned toward him. "Marcus!" Mayor Carter called, her voice steady, but her expression edged with tension. "People are scared. They need to know what the hell just happened." He nodded once, stepping forward, letting the crowd see him, letting them see all of them. 4 men who had stood between their home and the men who had come to destroy it. "Some of you already know," Marcus started, voice low but carrying across the street. "Some of you heard the gunfire. Some of you saw the bodies." He let that settle before continuing. "They came here tonight thinking they could take what they wanted. They came here to burn this town, to erase everything your families built, to make sure there was nothing left." A murmur ran through the crowd, anger bleeding into the fear, people shifting, fists clenching, heads shaking, but they didn't win. Marcus continued, "Because Haven's Rest isn't just a town, it's a home, and the only way they'll take it is over our dead bodies." He let his gaze sweep over them. "They aren't done. They're coming back, and we need to be ready." A voice rose from the crowd, a man in his late 60s, his face lined with years of labor, of struggle. "Ready how?" Marcus nodded toward Darius. "We'll teach you." Leon stepped forward. "Some of you already know how to shoot. The rest of you, you're gonna learn." Samuel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not just about guns. It's about knowing how to survive, how to move, how to fight smart." Mayor Carter took a step forward, facing the crowd. "If you want to leave, no one will stop you. But for those of you who are staying, we stand together." The murmurs grew louder, people shifting, looking at one another, gauging the moment, the weight of it. And then, one by one, heads nodded. Men, women, young, old. Haven's Rest wasn't just scared anymore. They were angry. An older woman near the front, her voice strong despite the tremble in her hands, lifted her chin. Tell us what we need to do." Marcus exhaled slowly, nodding. This wasn't just their fight anymore. It belonged to all of them. And when the Blooded Sons returned, they wouldn't be facing a handful of men. They'd be facing a town that refused to fall. The night air was thick with the smell of burned rubber and gunpowder, a lingering reminder of the battle that had torn through Haven's Rest only hours before. The town was quiet now, the kind of silence that came after the storm, but Marcus knew better than to believe it was over. This was just the beginning. The four of them sat around his kitchen table, the only light coming from a dim overhead bulb that flickered slightly, casting shadows across their faces. They had been here before, in other places, other wars, late-night debriefs after firefights, strategizing, adjusting, preparing for the next inevitable wave. Leon leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face before exhaling. "All right, let's talk about it. We know this ain't over. The question is, how bad is it gonna get?" Marcus tapped his fingers against the wood, his mind already sorting through the possibilities. "Bad," he said finally, voice steady, measured. "Worse than tonight. We hit them hard, harder than they expected. They're not gonna take that lightly." Darius, who had been silent up until now, shifted slightly, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. They came in expecting no resistance. They thought they'd roll in, put on a little show of force, scare the town into submission, but they didn't plan for us. They didn't expect this place to fight back. Leon scoffed. Hell, even some of the folks here didn't expect to fight back. But they did. And now that they've seen what we can do, they're in this. He ran a hand along the back of his neck, his brow furrowed. But the problem is, that's gonna piss the wrong people off. Samuel, who had been quietly watching them all, finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy. "We need to talk about him." He tilted his head toward the back room, where their captured prisoner was still locked up. "That man led them in here. He thought he was in charge. But if that was the case, then this whole operation was sloppy. Too sloppy. He was reckless, arrogant. He walked in here like he already owned the place, but he didn't plan for anything. That doesn't feel like leadership to me." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's been sitting with me too. He didn't act like a man with real power. He was loud. He wanted to be seen. The real ones? The ones actually running things? They don't operate like that. They don't throw themselves into the fight. They move the pieces from a distance." Darius' fingers drummed lightly against the table, his eyes narrowing slightly. "So you think he was just a field leader, a unit commander, not the one actually pulling the strings?" Leon exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Makes sense, but that begs the question. If he wasn't the real leader, then who the hell is? And how far does this go?" Samuel leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "We know the name the Blooded Sons, but groups like this, they don't just spring up overnight. Someone built them, funded them. Someone fed them their ideology, trained them, gave them weapons, a purpose. The way they moved, the way they tried to take this town, that wasn't random violence. That was planned, coordinated, which means someone out there is thinking 10 steps ahead." Marcus stared at the table for a long moment before speaking. "If that's true, then we need to figure out who it is. Fast. Because they're not done with us. We embarrassed them tonight. And if there's someone higher up, someone with real pull, they're not going to let this go." Darius exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. "They're already regrouping. We need to assume that, because anything else would be naive. The question is, how much time do we have?" Leon leaned back again, arms crossed. "Not enough. We crippled their first wave, but that just means the next one is going to come heavier. They'll bring reinforcements, more men, more firepower, probably outside help too. Militias, mercenaries, cops who sympathize with their cause. Hell, maybe all of the above." Marcus nodded. "That's what I'm thinking too. And if they're smart, they won't come at us the same way twice. This time, they'll send scouts ahead, test our defenses, Pick off weak points before committing to a full assault. Samuel's expression was unreadable, but there was something dark behind his eyes, which means the town needs to be ready, not just a few people. Everyone. The ones who picked up a rifle tonight, they were acting on adrenaline. But the next time, they need to act on instinct. That means training. That means strategy. That means knowing how to survive. Darius exhaled, rubbing his palms together slowly, thoughtfully. We need to make Haven's Rest something they can't take. Something too costly to even try. Leon shook his head. We already showed them we're willing to fight, but now we gotta make them afraid to fight us. Marcus ran a hand over his beard, thinking. We use their arrogance against them. They think they're stronger than us. We make them question that. We make them hesitate. That's how we survive this. If they think attacking means they die, they'll start second-guessing. And second-guessing gets men killed. Samuel tilted his head. And what about the prisoner? What's his role in this? Marcus exhaled slowly. We let him sit for a while. Let him think about what just happened. Then we put him to use. Darius's eyes darkened slightly. Interrogation? Marcus met his gaze. Something like that. He wants to act like a soldier? We'll see how long that lasts when he's alone, when there's no men at his back, no numbers to make him feel powerful. Eventually, he'll break. They always do. Leon smirked slightly. And if he doesn't? Marcus stood, rolling his shoulders. Then we keep moving. With or without him, we already know what we need to do. We train the town. We reinforce every weak spot. We turn this place into a fortress. And we make sure that when they come back, we bury every last one of them. Silence settled over the table, but it wasn't uncertainty. It was resolve. This wasn't a fight they had asked for, but it was a fight they would win. The first sign came at dawn. A single set of tire tracks cut deep into the dirt road leading toward the highway, fresh enough that Marcus knew they hadn't been there the night before. Someone had come in the dead of night, watching, scouting, marking the town for what was coming next. By noon, a drone buzzed high above Haven's Rest, circling lazily, its presence a quiet confirmation that the enemy was planning their next move. And by sunset, Marcus stood at the edge of town, staring at a distant line of headlights stretching across the horizon. They were coming. He turned back toward the main street, where the people of Haven's Rest had gathered, their faces lined with exhaustion, but not with fear. Not anymore. They had spent the last 2 days preparing, turning homes into bunkers, reinforcing windows and doors, setting up supply caches. The ones who could fight had trained relentlessly, learning to move, to shoot, to defend. The ones who couldn't had been moved to safer ground, tucked away in basements and hidden rooms, waiting for the storm to pass. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. Darius approached, rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes tracking the growing lights in the distance. They're coming in force. Marcus nodded. How long? Maybe an hour, maybe less. Leon let out a slow exhale, adjusting the straps on his vest. They're smarter this time. They're taking their time, making sure we see them coming. They want us to feel the weight of it before they hit. Samuel stepped up beside them, his expression unreadable. Let them. Won't change a damn thing. Marcus turned back to the crowd, scanning the faces of the men and women who had chosen to stand and fight. They weren't soldiers, but they were something more dangerous. People with something to lose. You all know what's coming, Marcus said, his voice steady, even. You know why they're here. They think they can take this place because they don't believe we belong here. They want to burn it, erase it, wipe it off the map like it never existed. He let the words settle, watching the anger flicker across their faces. They're wrong. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a slow building fire. Quiet, but certain. They'll come hard, Marcus continued. They'll hit us with everything they have. But we've spent the last 2 days making sure that when they do, they'll find nothing but hell waiting for them. He looked toward Darius, who gave a slight nod before stepping forward. Sniper teams are in position. We've got eyes on every approach, covering every angle. They won't move without us seeing them. Leon followed. Explosives are set. They roll too far in, They lose their wheels. They push through anyway. They lose their men. Samuel's voice was calm, assured. Medical stations are ready. We don't leave anyone behind. The town had no applause, no cheers, just grim determination. They weren't here to celebrate. They were here to survive. Marcus turned back toward the road. Positions. Now. They moved quickly, without hesitation, disappearing into the buildings, onto rooftops, behind cover. The town went silent. Then, in the distance, the first shot rang out. A single bullet, fired from one of Darius's snipers, punching through the windshield of a speeding truck. The driver's head snapped back, the vehicle veering wildly before crashing into the ditch, its tires still spinning. And then, all at once, the night exploded into chaos. Engines roared as the convoy surged forward, headlights cutting through the darkness, gunfire erupting from both sides. The Blooded Sons weren't testing the waters anymore. They were diving in head first, throwing everything they had into the fight. Marcus dropped behind cover, raising his rifle as the first wave came barreling through. He took his shots carefully, efficiently, dropping men before they could reach cover, before they could orient themselves. From the rooftops, Darius and his snipers moved like ghosts, picking off enemies one by one, bodies dropping before anyone could even locate the source of the shots. Then, the first explosion hit. Leon's traps ignited beneath the lead vehicles, fire and shrapnel ripping through steel and flesh alike. The impact sent bodies flying, scattering their forces before they could push deeper into town. The first wave was already collapsing, their assault thrown into disarray. But it wasn't enough to stop them. More trucks came, swerving around the wreckage, men spilling out, using the burning vehicles for cover. They were learning, adapting, moving faster than the first wave. They weren't retreating. They were here to finish what they started. Marcus ducked back behind cover as a burst of gunfire shredded the wood near his head, sending splinters into the air. He tapped his radio. They're pushing left flank. Cut 'em off before they regroup. Already on it. Darius's voice came through, followed by another sharp crack of a rifle. To the right, Samuel was leading a small team through the alleyways, moving fast, covering angles, keeping the fight fluid. They didn't let the enemy dig in, didn't let them gain a foothold. But even as they cut them down, more kept coming. This was a siege. This wasn't just one raid, one battle. This was an attempt to break them, to wear them down, to push them into submission through sheer force. And it was only the beginning. Gunfire tore through the night, bullets ricocheting off brick and steel, the sharp crack of rifles and the low, guttural bursts of automatic fire blending into a violent symphony. The air smelled of smoke and sweat, thick with the acrid burn of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Marcus moved through the chaos like a predator, every step measured, every breath steady, his rifle raised as he scanned the battlefield. The town was holding, but barely. The Blooded Sons weren't breaking like the first time. They weren't retreating in fear. They had come prepared. He ducked into an alley as a burst of gunfire shredded the wooden crates beside him, splinters flying past his face. He twisted, pressing his back against the brick wall, heart pounding but mind cold and calculating. They were pushing deeper now, bypassing the main streets, breaking into homes, targeting civilians. His radio crackled with Darius's voice. They're in the residential areas. They're not just trying to kill fighters. They're hunting families. A slow burn of rage settled in Marcus's chest, deep and cold. Keep them moving. Don't let them get comfortable. Got it, Darius responded, followed by the distant sharp crack of his rifle. Marcus pushed off the wall and moved, cutting through a side street, his boots light on the pavement, his mind already 2 steps ahead. The enemy was trying to spread them thin, force them to defend every street, every home, every doorway. It was smart, ruthless, designed to overwhelm. But they had made one mistake. They thought they could win through brutality alone. Marcus stepped into the next street, just as 3 Blooded Sons dragged a man from his house, his wife screaming, their young daughter clutching the doorframe, eyes wide with terror. Marcus didn't hesitate. He dropped the first man with a precise shot to the head, the rifle kicking against his shoulder as the second man spun, eyes widening. He didn't get the chance to react before Marcus was already moving, closing the distance, dropping the rifle in favor of something more personal. The second man swung first, sloppy, wild, too much adrenaline and not enough skill. Marcus slipped past the punch, caught his wrist, and twisted hard, sending the man crashing into the wall. The third attacker lunged with a knife, blade flashing under the dim streetlights, but Marcus redirected the momentum, slamming an elbow into the man's throat, cutting off his air before driving his knee into his ribs hard enough to hear something crack. The second man staggered forward again, recovered faster than expected, but Marcus was already waiting. He stepped into him, hooking an arm around his neck, twisting, cutting off circulation. The man thrashed for a second, choking, fingers clawing at Marcus's arm, but his movements slowed as his body lost oxygen. Marcus let him drop, unconscious, before turning to the last man still gasping on the ground. The man coughed, clutching his side, eyes filled with pain and confusion. He had thought this was going to be easy, thought he was part of something bigger, something unstoppable. Now he was bleeding in the dirt, realizing just how wrong he had been. Marcus crouched beside him, his voice calm. "You came here thinking you were going to wipe this place out, that you were the one with power. Look around." He gestured toward the town, where his people were still standing, still fighting, still refusing to break. "You were wrong." The man spat blood, muttering something Marcus didn't bother listening to. He struck him hard across the temple, just enough to knock him out, just enough to remind him that this wasn't his world anymore. The man inside the house stumbled forward, eyes wide with disbelief. Thank you, Get inside," Marcus ordered. "Lock your doors. Stay low. This isn't over yet." The man nodded, rushing back to his family, dragging his wife and daughter inside before sealing the door shut. Marcus retrieved his rifle, tapping his radio. "More of them are targeting homes. We need to pull them back to the main streets before this turns into a massacre." Leon's voice came through, tense but controlled. "On it." "Got some surprises waiting for them if they try to push through the old market district." Marcus moved again, cutting through the alley, stepping over bodies, past fires burning low in the streets, smoke curling into the air. He could hear the faint, rhythmic thump of approaching vehicles, more of them, circling back, trying to reinforce their failing assault. Then he saw him, the man standing near the wreckage of a burned-out truck, watching. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't calling orders. He was studying, calculating. Marcus knew immediately. This was the real leader. This was the one who had sent the first wave to die, the one who had waited to see what kind of resistance they were dealing with. He wasn't a grunt. He wasn't just another angry man with a gun. He was the kind of enemy who knew how to win wars, and he was already planning his next move. Marcus didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, sighted in, pulled the trigger. The leader moved at the last second. Fast. Too fast. The bullet grazed his shoulder instead of tearing through his chest, sending him staggering back. But he didn't panic. He turned, locked eyes with Marcus, and smirked. Then, before Marcus could fire again, he disappeared into the shadows. The fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The streets of Haven's Rest were chaos, burning with the echoes of gunfire and the sharp sounds of combat. The blooded suns had not scattered like last time. They had come back with